They say you never think it'll happen to you, that feeling where your world unravels in a single moment. Standing in the cold, empty hospital hallway, Emma felt smaller and more lost than she'd ever imagined possible. One minute, she had been on the phone with Liam, her voice echoing the same words she'd always said, "Be safe. I love you." It was just another call, just another part of their routine, and yet, those words turned out to be the last he'd remember from her. 5 years together had woven their lives together so seamlessly. It felt impossible to think that something could break them apart. Emma felt the memory of every morning they'd spent sipping coffee, every laugh they'd shared, every quiet evening where his hand had found hers as they drifted off to sleep. This was her future, her life, and yet here she was, waiting on the edge of something she couldn't control. She glanced down at her phone, her lock screen showing a photo of her and Liam from their last anniversary. How could she even imagine that everything they'd built could just vanish? The door to the operating room finally opened, and the doctor's footsteps broke through the thick silence that had settled over her. Emma's heart raced, clinging to any bit of hope that everything was fine, that Liam would remember her, that he'd come out of this exactly as he was before. She braced herself, holding on to that hope as the doctor approached. "Emma?" The doctor's voice was calm, measured, but his tone held a hesitation that made her stomach drop. "Yes, that's me. How is he? Is he going to be okay?" Her voice shook as she spoke, each word barely a whisper as her mind spun with worry. The doctor nodded, but there was something in his expression that made her feel like the ground beneath her was slipping. "Liam is stable," he said, his words a balm and yet a caution all at once. "The surgery went well, and physically, he's responding, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's an issue with his memory. We're seeing signs of retrograde amnesia. Certain parts of his life are clear to him, but others, they're missing." Emma felt her throat tighten. Missing? What did that mean? Surely he still remembered them, their life, their love. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the fear that crept in. "Missing?" she managed to ask. "He remembers his life though, right? Us?" The doctor's face softened, but his answer held a gravity that seemed to hit her like a wave. "He recalls fragments, bits and pieces, but there's one name he keeps mentioning, someone named Emily." Emily. The word lingered in the air, each syllable weighing down on her like a stone. "Emily," she repeated, her voice barely audible. A name she'd heard only once, years ago, whispered in a passing memory. A name tied to someone from his past. She was his first love. A shadow in the corners of his past life that Emma had never thought much of. She'd assumed that was long gone, part of another time, another life. But here she was, hearing that name again, now more present in Liam's mind than anything they'd built together. The doctor's words were still echoing in her mind, each syllable louder than the last. The life they'd built together, every small memory, seemed to fade into the background. It felt as though 5 years had been erased in a second, leaving only a ghost from Liam's past. As she fought to keep her composure, Emma forced a shaky smile and asked the question she needed to ask, even if she feared the answer. Does he remember anything about us? Our home, our plans, the life we've been building?" The doctor paused, his words gentle but unwavering. "He remembers emotions, impressions of warmth, feelings of comfort, but specific details? No, not yet. I'm sorry, Emma. Sometimes memories return in stages, but we can't predict when or if they will." The doctor's words echoed in Emma's mind as her thoughts spun out of control. Memories of her life with Liam flashed through her mind, each one a thread in the tapestry of their love. Yet here she was, realizing that, to him, those moments didn't exist. All she'd built and cherished was slipping away, leaving only her, standing alone in that sterile, unfeeling hallway. For a moment, she felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, if she went in there, he'd know her. He'd feel something when he looked at her, some glimmer of recognition. She had to believe it. She had to believe that after everything they'd shared, there'd be something left, something that even memory loss couldn't erase. Bracing herself, Emma stepped toward the door to Liam's hospital room. Her fingers hovered over the handle as she took a deep breath, steadying herself, hoping beyond hope that something would be there in his eyes. Even if he didn't remember everything, he'd remember her, she thought. He had to. Emma took a shaky breath as she finally turned the handle and stepped into Liam's hospital room. The beeping of machines filled the silence, each sound sharp and unforgiving, a reminder of how fragile life and memories could be. Liam lay on the bed, his face pale against the white pillows, and for a moment, Emma felt an overwhelming rush of relief. He was alive. But that relief was quickly swallowed by a deeper fear as she saw his gaze drift over her, unfocused and distant, like she was just another face in a crowd. "Liam?" Her voice came out small, hopeful, as if saying his name might somehow bring him back to her. She took a step closer, trying to smile, trying to remember how they always teased each other after a long day, how they always knew what the other was thinking without a word. Liam blinked, looking at her with a faint curiosity, but there was no recognition in his eyes, only a polite confusion. "Hi," he murmured, his voice soft, unsure. You look familiar. Are you here with Emily?" The name hit Emma like a punch to the chest, knocking the air out of her. She forced a smile, fighting to keep her composure. "No, Liam. It's me, Emma." He frowned, studying her face as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. "Emma," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the name for the first time. There was no warmth, no spark of recognition, just a faint, almost uncomfortable interest, like someone trying to remember a detail they'd once overheard. Emma's voice faltered, her throat tightening, but she pressed on, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm your girlfriend, Liam. We've been together for 5 years." Liam's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing as he struggled to process her words. 5 years? He repeated, almost to himself, as if he couldn't quite believe it. His gaze softened slightly, but there was still that wall between them, an emptiness she could feel widening with every second. I don't understand," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember someone else. Her name, Emily. She's the one I loved, the one I wanted a future with. I don't remember you, Emma. I don't remember us." Emma's heart twisted painfully, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew it wasn't his fault, knew that this was the result of the accident, of the trauma he'd been through. But that knowledge didn't stop the ache, didn't soften the sharp edges of his words. She swallowed hard, looking down, her hands clenching and unclenching as she fought to keep her emotions in check. "I understand," she whispered, her voice trembling despite herself. It's not your fault, Liam. It's just hard, you know? We've been together so long, and now I feel like a stranger to you." He looked away, a flicker of guilt crossing his face, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow of the man she'd known, the man she'd loved. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her standing there in a silence that felt colder than the hospital room. Maybe I'll remember, eventually," he murmured, more to himself than to her, his voice hollow, uncertain. "But right now, all I know is this feeling I have, this connection to Emily. It's like she's the only thing that feels real to me." Emma swallowed back the tears that threatened to spill, nodding slowly. She knew she couldn't push him, couldn't force memories to come back. But hearing him talk about his love for another woman, a woman she'd thought was part of his past, was like a dagger twisting in her heart. "I understand," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. I'll give you space, Liam. I'll let you figure things out. Just know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She forced herself to turn away, to walk out of the room before he could see the tears that had started to fall. Emma closed the door softly behind her, the hollow ache in her chest growing deeper with each step she took down the sterile hospital corridor. Her mind was swirling, replaying Liam's words, that distant look in his eyes, the painful way he'd said Emily, as if she were the only part of him that still felt real. The very name echoed in Emma's mind, reverberating with a mix of disbelief and hurt. Outside the hospital, the world carried on, indifferent to her grief. People passed by, immersed in their own lives, laughing, talking, completely unaware of the invisible fracture in Emma's heart. She stood there on the curb, clutching her phone like it could somehow anchor her. Her thumb hovered over the call button, a familiar habit she'd formed over years of reaching out to Liam whenever something went wrong. But now, the person she'd always leaned on was gone, replaced by a man who barely knew her name. For days, she continued her visits to the hospital, trying to be there for him, trying to bring back fragments of the life they'd shared. She brought little things she thought might jog his memory. A scarf he'd gifted her during their first winter together, the playlist they'd made during a road trip, photos of their vacations and birthdays. Each item carried a memory, a story that had woven them together. But each time she showed them to Liam, his response was the same. Polite confusion, a vague curiosity, and a distant sorrow she couldn't reach. The hardest part was watching him search her face, as if waiting for something to click, for some feeling to rise up, but it never came. And with each day that passed, she felt herself slipping further and further into the background of his life. She'd sit by his bed, holding his hand, sharing stories about them, moments that had once made him laugh, but now only left him quiet, listening with a mixture of politeness and discomfort. One afternoon, Emma sat across from him, holding a picture from their anniversary. She forced a smile, tracing the edges of the photo. "This was one of our best nights. You took me to that little Italian restaurant by the lake, remember? You said it was the happiest you'd been in years." Liam took the picture, studying it intently, his brow furrowing. "I can see how much it meant to you," he murmured, his tone soft but detached. I don't feel it, Emma. I wish I could, but I just don't." Each word sank deeper than the last, a reminder that the memories that meant the world to her were now just shadows to him. She forced herself to nod, her heart heavy with the weight of each memory that only she seemed to carry. Then, one evening, she found him sitting by the window, his gaze fixed on the city lights. There was something different in his expression, a look of quiet longing that made her stomach twist. As she approached, he spoke without looking at her. "I had a dream about her," he said softly, his voice filled with a tenderness she hadn't heard before. "Emily, I don't know why, but it felt so real, like she was right there, just waiting for me. I felt happy." Emma's heart shattered, but she held herself together, listening, her own emotions locked away. She didn't dare interrupt. "I wish I could explain it," he continued. "But it's like she's the only thing that makes sense. I don't know why I can't feel that with you." The words hung in the air, each one piercing deeper than the last. Emma knew he wasn't trying to hurt her, that he was only speaking his truth. But knowing that didn't make the pain any less real. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you just need more time. Maybe the memories will come back and you'll remember everything we shared." Liam looked at her, a flicker of something she couldn't quite read in his eyes. "Maybe," he agreed. But the uncertainty lingered, a gulf between them that no words could bridge. As she left that night, Emma realized that she was clinging to a man who no longer existed. And though she wanted more than anything to stay by his side, to wait and hope, a small part of her wondered if she was only setting herself up to be forgotten again and again. Emma's days became a cycle of hope and heartache. Every morning she would wake up and convince herself that today would be different, that maybe today Liam would recognize her, remember something, anything, about the life they'd shared. And each night, she would return home carrying the same hollow ache, the weight of another day where she remained a stranger in the eyes of the man she loved. On one of her visits, Emma noticed Liam gazing out of his hospital window, his expression distant, yet serene. As she entered the room, he turned to her with a slight, polite smile, the kind you'd offer to an acquaintance. She felt the familiar sting of disappointment, but she forced herself to smile back, keeping the hurt hidden beneath a layer of calm. "Hey," she greeted him softly, sitting down beside his bed. She'd brought a few old photo albums from their trips, ones filled with pictures of the moments that had defined their relationship. She opened to a page with a picture of them laughing on the beach, their faces bright with joy and sand clinging to their skin. "Do you remember this day?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'd driven 3 hours to get there. You insisted on watching the sunrise, even though it meant leaving in the middle of the night. I was so tired, but you..." She paused, her smile wavering. "You said it would be worth it?" And it was. Liam looked at the photo, his brow furrowing as he tried to connect the dots. After a moment, he shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, Emma. I can see how much it meant to us, but it's like looking at someone else's memories." The words hit her like a slap, but she managed to hold her composure. "I understand, she replied quietly. "It's not your fault. None of this is." But the truth was, it felt like a kind of loss she couldn't explain. She was grieving the absence of someone who was right in front of her, a living ghost of the man she loved. And no matter how many photos she showed him, no matter how many stories she shared, she couldn't bridge the gap between them. Then one evening, while she was sitting by his bedside, Liam reached for her hand. For a fleeting second, Emma felt a rush of hope, thinking that perhaps finally there was a spark of recognition. But as his fingers closed around hers, he looked up, his eyes filled with that familiar confusion. "Emma," he began slowly, "I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. I know this hasn't been easy for you, being here, day after day, when I can't remember us." He hesitated, his voice tinged with regret. "I just don't want you to keep holding on if I can't ever give you back what we had. I don't want you to keep hoping for something that might never come." Her throat tightened, her chest heavy with the words she wished she could say. She wanted to scream, to tell him that she'd wait forever if it meant having him back, but the reality of his words settled over her, cold and unyielding. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was holding on to something that was gone, something that only she remembered. Still, she held his hand tighter, unwilling to let go just yet. "I don't mind waiting," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Even if you can't remember, I'll remember for both of us. I'm here because I want to be, Liam. Because I believe that one day you'll remember and we'll find our way back to each other." He looked down, a flicker of sadness passing over his face. "I wish I could promise you that," he murmured. "But all I feel is this emptiness, like there's a part of me that's missing, and I don't know how to find it." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart breaking for the both of them. She could see that he was as lost as she was, trapped in a space where the past and present couldn't reconcile. And though she wanted more than anything to reach him, to remind him of the love they'd shared, she was beginning to understand that this wasn't something she could force. It had to come from him. "Maybe you just need time," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Maybe, with time, everything will come back." Liam offered a faint, almost apologetic smile. "Maybe," he echoed, though there was no conviction in his voice. They both knew it was only a fragile hope, one they were clinging to because it was all they had left. As Emma left the hospital that night, she felt a shift within herself, a quiet understanding settling over her. She'd spent so much time trying to hold on to the man Liam used to be, hoping that if she loved him enough, he'd come back to her. But now, she was beginning to see that loving him might mean letting him go. Allowing him the space to find himself, even if it meant walking a path that no longer included her. Days turned into weeks, and Emma's visits became quieter, filled less with stories of the past and more with simple companionship. She'd sit beside Liam, letting the silence settle around them, hoping that perhaps her presence alone would be enough to trigger something, a memory, a spark, a feeling that might bring him back. One evening, she brought a small, faded notebook she'd found buried in her drawer, filled with letters she'd written to Liam over the years. She'd always loved writing notes to him, messages tucked away in pockets, on sticky notes, on the refrigerator door. Sometimes they were simple reminders or jokes. Other times she'd pour her heart into them, capturing moments she didn't want to fade. As she held the notebook, she hesitated, wondering if sharing these letters would help him remember or only drive them further apart. She decided to read a few, the words soft on her lips, careful, as though she was speaking to a memory rather than the man in front of her. "Listen to this one," she began, smiling gently despite herself. "I wrote it right after that horrible camping trip you convinced me to go on." She laughed softly, more to herself. "It rained the entire time, and we were miserable, but when I look back, it's still one of my favorite memories." She looked over at Liam, whose face showed polite interest but not the recognition she'd hoped for. Ignoring the pang in her chest, she continued reading, pouring all the warmth and love into each word, hoping they might reach him somehow. But as the days passed, Emma noticed a subtle shift. Liam began asking her questions about their life together, questions he hadn't asked before. He'd listen carefully as she recounted little details, nodding slowly, as though he was trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. One day, he looked at her, his gaze lingering. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "I mean, after everything. You could have walked away, found someone else who could give you everything I can't. Why did you stay?" Emma felt her heart skip a beat, her breath catching at the unexpected question. She'd thought about that answer so many times, had replayed the reasons in her mind on countless sleepless nights. But here, with him looking at her like a stranger who somehow wanted to understand, she realized that the answer was simple. "Because I loved you," she whispered, her voice steady but soft. "I didn't stay because I expected you to remember. I stayed because the man I knew was worth waiting for. And even now, even if you don't remember us, I know that part of you is still in there, somewhere." He looked away, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his hospital blanket. "Sometimes I feel like I know you, like there's this familiarity when you're around, but every time I try to hold on to it, it slips away. It's like trying to remember a dream. You can almost see it, but it fades the moment you open your eyes." Emma listened, her heart heavy, understanding that he was caught between worlds, the one he remembered and the one she belonged to. She wanted to reach across the divide, to bring him back to her, but she knew she couldn't force what wasn't there. As the conversation continued, he asked more questions, showing an interest that hadn't been there before. He wanted to know about her life, her dreams, the person she was outside of their relationship. And slowly, Emma realized that he was seeing her not as a stranger, but as someone new, someone worth knowing. The painful irony wasn't lost on her, that she was becoming a different person to him, a new person, rather than the one she'd been for all those years. Toward the end of her visit, as she prepared to leave, Liam reached for her hand, his grip gentle yet firm, something she hadn't felt since before the accident. "Thank you, Emma," he said quietly. "For everything. I know it's not easy being here when I can't remember, but you make me want to try. You make me want to remember." The words warmed her heart, filling her with a cautious hope she hadn't felt in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something. A bridge being built, a path he was willing to take to meet her halfway. But as she walked out of the hospital that evening, she also felt a strange unease, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind. She realized that the man Liam was now might never fully remember the life they'd shared. And if that were the case, she would have to make a decision. To love him as he was now, or to hold on to the memory of who he used to be. As Emma continued her visits, a fragile new routine settled between her and Liam. There was no longer the heavy weight of unmet expectations or the painful reminders of what he'd forgotten. Instead, they shared quiet moments. Emma reading to him from her favorite books, Liam asking about the music they used to listen to, or even her bringing him his favorite tea from the cafe they used to frequent. She began to feel as if she was rebuilding something with him. Not quite the life they'd shared, but something else. Something new. One afternoon, as they sat by the window, a soft drizzle tapping against the glass, Liam turned to her with a faint smile. "I think, maybe I'm starting to remember," he said, his voice tentative, as if afraid the words would break the delicate connection between them. "It's not clear, but sometimes I get these flashes. Like seeing you, I'll feel something. A warmth, maybe a memory. And for a second, it's like I know exactly who you are to me." Emma's heart leapt, hope and caution warring within her. "What do you remember?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He closed his eyes, a slight frown creasing his brow. "I remember, a night by the water, laughing at something, feeling like there was no one else in the world but us. I remember the way you'd always tuck your hair behind your ear when you were nervous." He opened his eyes and looked at her, a vulnerability she hadn't seen in a long time. But it's like these memories are floating, just out of reach. They're there, but faded. Emma bit her lip, wanting to fill in the gaps, to tell him every detail, every feeling. But she also knew that pushing too hard might send those memories drifting even further away. She nodded, offering him a gentle smile. "That night by the water, that was the day we promised each other forever. It was our spot, our quiet place. We'd go there whenever life got too noisy, just to escape for a while." Liam nodded, his gaze softening, a wistful smile on his lips. "It sounds familiar, like it's something I'd do." The days that followed were a delicate dance, Liam's tentative memories resurfacing like distant echoes. Every so often, he'd ask Emma about a certain moment, and she'd gently guide him, careful not to overwhelm him. Slowly, she noticed a change in his demeanor. He began to smile when she entered the room, the distant politeness replaced by a warmth that hinted at something deeper. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the room, Liam reached for Emma's hand, holding it in both of his. The silence between them felt charged, filled with all the unspoken words they'd both kept inside. "Emma," he murmured, his voice steady but soft, "I know I'm still missing pieces, but I think I understand now. I may not remember everything, but I feel something real for you, something that feels like it's always been there." Emma's heart raced, a cautious joy blooming within her. She squeezed his hand, her own words caught in her throat. This was what she'd been waiting for, hoping for. A sign that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been lost. But even as relief washed over her, she couldn't ignore the flicker of doubt that lingered. The knowledge that the Liam sitting before her was different, changed, and that their love, if it bloomed again, would be something altogether new. As if sensing her hesitation, Liam looked down, taking a steadying breath. "But I know it's not the same," he continued, his voice low. "I'm not the man you remember. I wish I was, but I'm different now. And I don't want to hold you here, waiting for someone who may never come back." Emma felt a pang of sorrow, but there was also a strange comfort in his honesty. She'd been waiting, clinging to memories, hoping for the past to return. But maybe Liam was right. Maybe the man she'd loved was gone, and in his place was someone new, someone she could either embrace or let go. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Liam, I loved the man you were. And maybe you're right, maybe that man is gone, but what I feel for you now, it's still real. I'm here because I want to be, not because I'm waiting for the past to come back." A look of relief crossed Liam's face, his fingers tightening around hers. "Then let's see where this goes," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if the words themselves were too fragile to be spoken aloud. They sat there in the fading light, a quiet understanding passing between them. Emma knew that their love, if it grew again, would be different, something rebuilt from the fragments of their past. But in that moment, as they held each other's hands, she realized that maybe this new love, unburdened by memory and expectation, was worth the risk. In the following weeks, Emma and Liam began to find a rhythm, a tentative connection that felt both familiar and strange. They spent time together in small ways, sharing coffee, walking through the hospital gardens, and even laughing at jokes they used to share. For Emma, it was like piecing together fragments of an old dream, finding pieces of the man she loved in this new, uncertain version of him. One evening, as they walked along a quiet path outside the hospital, Liam stopped and turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. "Emma," he began, his voice hesitant, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything, and there's something I need to be honest with you about." Emma's heart skipped a beat, a mix of anticipation and anxiety settling over her. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady, though she felt anything but. Liam took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I know we've been trying to rebuild something, to find a way back to what we had. And I'm so grateful that you've stayed, that you've been here when it would have been easier to walk away. But I can't shake the feeling that there are still parts of me, of us, that I may never remember. I don't want you to feel like you're waiting for something that might never come." Emma looked away, her gaze drifting to the lights shimmering in the distance. She'd known, deep down, that this day might come, that Liam might never fully return to her as he once was. But hearing him say it out loud brought a finality that stung, a reality she'd been avoiding for as long as she could. "I understand," she murmured, forcing a small smile though her heart ached. "I knew this might happen, that things might not go back to the way they were. But what we have now, it's enough for me. Maybe it's different. Maybe it's not the same as it used to be, but that doesn't make it any less real." Liam's gaze softened, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "You deserve so much more, Emma. You deserve someone who remembers every moment, who can give you the same love you've given. And I don't want to hold you back from finding that." Emma's throat tightened, and she felt the weight of her emotions press down on her. She'd spent so much time hoping, believing that they could find their way back to each other, that love could bridge the gaps memory couldn't fill. But now, faced with Liam's honesty, she realized that she couldn't keep holding on to the past, to a version of him that may never return. She took a step closer, reaching up to gently touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar lines she'd once known so well. "Liam, I don't regret a single moment I've spent with you, even now, and I'll cherish every memory we've made, whether you remember them or not. But maybe it's time for me to let go, to let us both find the happiness we deserve." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she held his gaze, her own eyes steady, filled with a quiet acceptance. Liam nodded, his expression a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I don't want to lose you, Emma. You've been the one constant in all of this. But I think we both need a chance to start fresh, without the weight of what was." They stood there, wrapped in the silence of their understanding, both grieving the love they'd shared and accepting the new paths they had to take. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with both pain and release, a farewell to a love that had once meant everything, and a step toward the unknown. As they parted, Emma felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet strength that came from finally letting go. She had loved deeply, and though it hadn't ended the way she'd hoped, she knew she would carry the memory of that love with her, unchanging, even as she moved forward. And as she walked away, leaving the hospital and the life she'd once known behind, she felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe one day she'd find a new beginning waiting for her, unburdened by the shadows of the past.